Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Chapter 57. Now that I was left wholly to myself, I gave notice of my intention to quit the chambers in the temple as soon as my tenancy could legally determine, and in the meanwhile to underlet them. At once I put bills up in the windows, for I was in debt and had scarcely any money, and began to be seriously alarmed by the state of my affairs. I ought rather to write that I should have been alarmed if I had had energy and concentration enough to help me to the clear perception of any truth beyond the fact that I was falling very ill. The late stress upon me had enabled me to put off illness, but not to put it away. I knew that it was coming on me now, and I knew very little else, and was even careless as to that. For a day or two, I lay on the sofa or on the floor, anywhere according as I happened to sink down, with a heavy head and aching limbs and no purpose and no power. Then there came one night which appeared of great duration and which teemed with anxiety and horror. And when in the morning I tried to sit up in my bed and think of it, I found I could not do so. Whether I really had been down in Garden Court in the dead of the night, groping about for the boat that I supposed to be there, whether I had 2 or 3 times come to myself on the staircase with great terror, not knowing how I had got out of bed, whether I had found myself lighting the lamp, possessed by the idea that he was coming up the stairs, and that the lights were blown out, whether I had been inexpressibly harassed by the distracted talking, laughing, and groaning of someone, and had half suspected those sounds to be of my own making, whether there had been a closed iron furnace in a dark corner of the room, and a voice had called out over and over again that Miss Havisham was consuming within it. These were things that I tried to settle with myself and get into some order as I lay that morning on my bed. But the vapor of a lime kiln would come between me and them, disordering them all, and it was through the vapor at last that I saw 2 men looking at me. "What do you want?" I asked, starting. "I don't know you." "Well, sir," returned one of them, bending down and touching me on the shoulder, "this is a matter that you'll soon arrange, I dare say, but you're arrested." "What is the debt?" £123, 15, 6. Jeweler's account, I think. "What is to be done?" "You had better come to my house," said the man. "I keep a very nice house." I made some attempt to get up and dress myself. When I next attended to them, they were standing a little off from the bed looking at me. I still lay there. "You see my state," said I. "I would come with you if I could, but indeed I am quite unable. If you take me from here, I think I shall die by the way." Perhaps they replied, or argued the point, or tried to encourage me to believe that I was better than I thought, for as much as they hang in my memory by only this one slender thread, I don't know what they did, except that they forbore to remove me, that I had a fever and was avoided, that I suffered greatly, that I often lost my reason, that the time seemed interminable, that I confounded impossible existences with my own identity, that I was a brick in the house wall, and yet entreating to be released from the giddy place where the builders had set me, that I was a steel beam of a vast engine, clashing and whirling over a gulf, and yet that I implored in my own person to have the engine stopped and my part in it hammered off, that I passed through these phases of disease, I know of my own remembrance, and did in some sort know at the time, that I sometimes struggled with real people in the belief that they were murderers, and that I would all at once comprehend that they meant to do me good, and would then sink exhausted in their arms and suffer them to lay me down, I also knew at the time. But above all, I knew that there was a constant tendency in all these people, who when I was very ill, would present all kinds of extraordinary transformations of the human face, and would be much dilated in size. Above all, I say, I knew that there was an extraordinary tendency in all these people sooner or later to settle down into the likeness of Joe. After I had turned the worst point of my illness, I began to notice that while all its other features changed, this one consistent feature did not change. Whoever came about me still settled down into Joe. I opened my eyes in the night, and I saw, in the great chair at the bedside, Joe. I opened my eyes in the day, and, sitting on the window seat smoking his pipe in the shaded open window, still I saw Joe. I asked for cooling drink, and the dear hand that gave it me was Joe's. I sank back on my pillow after drinking, and the face that looked so hopefully and tenderly upon me was the face of Joe. At last one day I took courage and said, "Is it Joe?" And the dear old home voice answered, "Which it air, old chap." "Oh, Joe, you break my heart. Look angry at me, Joe. Strike me, Joe. Tell me of my ingratitude. Don't be so good to me." For Joe had actually laid his head down on the pillow at my side and put his arm round my neck in his joy that I knew him. "Which dear old Pip, old chap," said Joe. "You and me was ever friends. And when you're well enough to go out for a ride, what larks." After which, Joe withdrew to the window and stood with his back towards me, wiping his eyes. And as my extreme weakness prevented me from getting up and going to him, I lay there, penitently whispering, "Oh, God bless him. Oh, God bless this gentle Christian man." Joe's eyes were red when I next found him beside me, but I was holding his hand, and we both felt happy. "How long, dear Joe?" Which you better say, Pip, how long have your illness lasted, dear old chap? "Yes, Joe. It's the end of May, Pip. Tomorrow is the 1st of June. And have you been here all that time, dear Joe?" "Pretty nigh, old chap. For as I says to Biddy when the news of your being ill were brought by letter, which it were brought by the post, and being formerly single he is now married, though underpaid for a deal of walking and shoe leather. But wealth were not a object on his part, and marriage were the great wish of his heart. It is so delightful to hear you, Joe. But I interrupt you in what you said to Biddy." "Which it were," said Joe, "that how you might be amongst strangers, and that how you and me, having been ever friends, a visit at such a moment might not prove unacceptable. And Biddy, her word were, 'Go to him without loss of time.'" "That," said Joe, summing up with his judicial air, "were the word of Biddy. 'Go to him,' Biddy say, 'without loss of time.' In short, I shouldn't greatly deceive you," Joe added, after a little grave reflection, "if I represented to you that the word of that young woman were, 'without a minute's loss of time.'" There, Joe cut himself short and informed me that I was to be talked to in great moderation, and that I was to take a little nourishment at stated frequent times, whether I felt inclined for it or not, and that I was to submit myself to all his orders. So I kissed his hand and lay quiet, while he proceeded to indite a note to Biddy with my love in it. Evidently Biddy had taught Joe to write. As I lay in bed looking at him, it made me, in my weak state, cry again with pleasure to see the pride with which he set about his letter. My bedstead, divested of its curtains, had been removed with me upon it into the sitting room as the airiest and largest, and the carpet had been taken away, and the room kept always fresh and wholesome night and day. At my own writing table, pushed into a corner and cumbered with little bottles, Joe now sat down to his great work, first choosing a pen from the pen tray as if it were a chest of large tools, and tucking up his sleeves as if he were going to wield a crowbar or sledgehammer. It was necessary for Joe to hold on heavily to the table with his left elbow, and to get his right leg well out behind him before he could begin. And when he did begin, he made every downstroke so slowly that it might have been 6 feet long, while at every upstroke I could hear his pen spluttering extensively. He had a curious idea that the inkstand was on the side of him where it was not, and constantly dipped his pen into space and seemed quite satisfied with the result. Occasionally he was tripped up by some orthographical stumbling block, but on the whole he got on very well indeed, and when he had signed his name and had removed a finishing blot from the paper to the crown of his head with his 2 forefingers, he got up and hovered about the table, trying the effect of his performance from various points of view, as it lay there, with unbounded satisfaction. Not to make Joe uneasy by talking too much, even if I had been able to talk much, I deferred asking him about Miss Havisham until next day. He shook his head when I then asked him if she had recovered. "Is she dead, Joe?" "Why, you see, old chap," said Joe in a tone of remonstrance, and by way of getting at it by degrees, "I wouldn't go so far as to say that, for that's a deal to say, but she ain't." "Living, Joe?" "That's nigher where it is," said Joe. "She ain't living." "Did she linger long, Joe?" "Arter you was took ill, pretty much about what you might call, if you was put to it, a week," said Joe, still determined on my account to come at everything by degrees. "Dear Joe, have you heard what becomes of her property?" "Well, old chap," said Joe, "it do appear that she had settled the most of it, which I meant her say tied it up on Miss Estella. But she had wrote out a little codle shell in her own hand a day or two afore the accident, leaving a cool 4,000 to Mr. Matthew Pocket. And why do you suppose, above all things, Pip, she left that cool 4,000 unto him?" "Because of Pip's account of him, the said Matthew." "I am told by Biddy that ere the writing," said Joe, repeating the legal turn as if it did him infinite good, "account of him the said Matthew, and a cool 4,000 Pip." I never discovered from whom Joe derived the conventional temperature of the 4,000 pounds, but it appeared to make the sum of money more to him, and he had a manifest relish in insisting on its being cool. This account gave me great joy, as it perfected the only good thing I had done. I asked Joe whether he had heard if any of the other relations had any legacies. "Miss Sarah," said Joe, "she have 25-pound perannium fur to buy pills on account of being bilious. Miss Georgiana, she have 20 pound down. Mrs. What's the name of them wild beasts with humps, old chap?" "Camels," said I, wondering why he could possibly want to know. Joe nodded. "Mrs. Camels," by which I presently understood he meant Camilla. "She have 5 pound fur to buy rushlights to put her in spirits when she wake up in the night." The accuracy of these recitals was sufficiently obvious to me to give me great confidence in Joe's information. "And now," said Joe, "you ain't that strong yet, old chap, that you can take in more nor one additional shovelful today. Old Orlick, he's been a-bustin' open a dwelling house." "Whose?" said I. "Not, I grant you, but what his manners is given to blusterous," said Joe apologetically. "Still, a Englishman's house is his castle, and castles must not be busted cept when done in wartime. And Watsomer, the failings on his part, he were a corn and seedsman in his heart." "Is it Pumblechook's house that has been broken into, then?" "That's it, Pip," said Joe, "and they took his till, and they took his cash box, and they drinked his wine, and they partook of his wittles, and they slapped his face, and they pulled his nose, and they tied him up to his bedpost, and they give him a dozen, and they stuffed his mouth full of flowering annuals to prevent his crying out. But he knowed Orlick, and Orlick's in the county jail." By these approaches we arrived at unrestricted conversation. I was slow to gain strength, but I did slowly and surely become less weak, and Joe stayed with me, and I fancied I was little Pip again. For the tenderness of Joe was so beautifully proportioned to my need that I was like a child in his hands. He would sit and talk to me in the old confidence and with the old simplicity and in the old unassertive protecting way, so that I would half believe that all my life since the days of the old kitchen was one of the mental troubles of the fever that was gone. He did everything for me except the household work, for which he had engaged a very decent woman after paying off the laundress on his first arrival. "Which I do assure you, Pip," he would often say in explanation of that liberty, "I found her a-tapping the spare bed like a cask of beer and drawing off the feathers in a bucket for sale, which she would have tapped your next and drawed it off with you a-laying on it, and was then a-carrying away the coals gradually in the soup tureen and vegetable dishes, and the wine and spirits in your Wellington boots. We looked forward to the day when I should go out for a ride, as we had once looked forward to the day of my apprenticeship. And when the day came, and an open carriage was got into the lane, Joe wrapped me up, took me in his arms, carried me down to it, and put me in, as if I were still the small, helpless creature to whom he had so abundantly given of the wealth of his great nature. And Joe got in beside me, and we drove away together into the country, where the rich summer growth was already on the trees and on the grass, and sweet summer scents filled all the air. The day happened to be Sunday, and when I looked on the loveliness around me and thought how it had grown and changed, and how the little wildflowers had been forming, and the voices of the birds had been strengthening, by day and by night, under the sun and under the stars, while poor I lay burning and tossing on my bed, the mere remembrance of having burned and tossed there came like a check upon my peace. But when I heard the Sunday bells, and looked around a little more upon the outspread beauty, I felt that I was not nearly thankful enough, that I was too weak yet to be even that, and I laid my head on Joe's shoulder, as I had laid it long ago when he had taken me to the fair or where not, and it was too much for my young senses. More composure came to me after a while, and we talked as we used to talk, lying on the grass at the old Battery. There was no change whatever in Joe. Exactly what he had been in my eyes then, he was in my eyes still, just as simply faithful and as simply right. When we got back again, and he lifted me out and carried me so easily across the court and up the stairs, I thought of that eventful Christmas day when he had carried me over the marshes. We had not yet made any allusion to my change of fortune, nor did I know how much of my late history he was acquainted with. I was so doubtful of myself now, and put so much trust in him, that I could not satisfy myself whether I ought to refer to it when he did not. "Have you heard, Joe?" I asked him that evening, upon further consideration, as he smoked his pipe at the window, "who my patron was?" "I heerd," returned Joe, "as it were not Miss Havisham, old chap." "Did you hear who it was, Joe?" "Well, I heard as it were a person what sent the person would give you the banknotes at the Jolly Bargeman, Pip." "So it was." "Astonishing," said Joe, in the placidest way. "Did you hear that he was dead, Joe?" I presently asked with increasing diffidence. "Which? Him as sent the banknotes, Pip?" "Yes." "I think," said Joe, after meditating a long time and looking rather evasively at the window seat, "as I did hear tell that Howie were something or another in a general way in that direction." "Did you hear anything of his circumstances, Joe?" "Not particular, Pip." "If you would like to hear, Joe, I was beginning when Joe got up and came to my sofa. "Looky here, old chap," said Joe, bending over me. "Ever the best of friends. Ain't us, Pip?" I was ashamed to answer him. "Werry good, then," said Joe, as if I had answered. "That's all right. That's agreed upon. Then why go into subjects, old chap, which as betwixt two sech must be forever unnecessary? There's subjects enough as betwixt two sech, without unnecessary ones. Lord, to think of your poor sister and her rampages, and don't you remember Tickler?" "I do indeed, Joe." "Looky here, old chap," said Joe. "I done what I could to keep you and Tickler in sunders, but my power were not always fully equal to my inclinations. For when your poor sister had a mind to drop into you, it were not so much," said Joe, in his favorite argumentative way, "that she dropped into me too, if I put myself in opposition to her, but that she dropped into you always heavier for it. I noticed that. It ain't a grab at a man's whisker, not yet a shake or two of a man, to which your sister was quite welcome, that had put a man off from getting a little child out of punishment. But when that little child is dropped into heavier for that grab of whisker or shaking, then that man naturally up and says to himself, 'Where is the good as you are a-doing? I grant you I see the arm,' says the man, 'but I don't see the good. I call upon you, sir, therefore to pint out the good.' The man says?" I observed, as Joe waited for me to speak. "The man says," Joe assented. "Is he right, that man?" "Dear Joe, he is always right." "Well, old chap," said Joe, "then abide by your words. If he's always right, which in general he's more likely wrong, he's right when he says this. Supposing ever you kept any little matter to yourself, when you was a little child, you kept it mostly because you knowed as J. Gargery's power to part you and Tickler in sunders were not fully equal to his inclinations. Therefore, think no more of it as betwixt two sech, and do not let us pass remarks upon unnecessary subjects. Biddy give herself a deal of trouble with me afore I left, for I'm almost awful dull, as I should view it in this light, and, viewing it in this light, as I should so put it. Both of which," said Joe, quite charmed with his logical arrangement, "being done, now this to you a true friend say. Namely, you mustn't go overdoing on it, but you must have your supper and your wine and water, and you must be put betwixt the sheets." The delicacy with which Joe dismissed this theme, and the sweet tact and kindness with which Biddy, who with her woman's wit had found me out so soon, had prepared him for it, made a deep impression on my mind. But whether Joe knew how poor I was, and how my great expectations had all dissolved like our own marsh mists before the sun, I could not understand. Another thing in Joe that I could not understand when it first began to develop itself, but which I soon arrived at a sorrowful comprehension of, was this. As I became stronger and better, Joe became a little less easy with me. In my weakness and entire dependence on him, the dear fellow had fallen into the old tone and called me by the old names, the dear old Pip, old chap, that now were music in my ears. I, too, had fallen into the old ways, only happy and thankful that he let me. But, imperceptibly, though I held by them fast, Joe's hold upon them began to slacken, and whereas I wondered at this at first, I soon began to understand that the cause of it was in me, and that the fault of it was all mine. Ah, had I given Joe no reason to doubt my constancy, and to think that in prosperity I should grow cold to him and cast him off? Had I given Joe's innocent heart no cause to feel instinctively that as I got stronger, his hold upon me would be weaker, and that he had better loosen it in time and let me go before I plucked myself away? It was on the third or fourth occasion of my going out, walking in the temple gardens leaning on Joe's arm, that I saw this change in him very plainly. We had been sitting in the bright warm sunlight, looking at the river, and I chanced to say as we got up, "See, Joe, I can walk quite strongly. Now, you shall see me walk back by myself." "Which do not overdo it, Pip," said Joe, "but I shall be happy for to see you able, sir." The last word grated on me, but how could I remonstrate? I walked no further than the gate of the gardens, and then pretended to be weaker than I was, and asked Joe for his arm. Joe gave it me, but was thoughtful. I, for my part, was thoughtful too, for how best to check this growing change in Joe was a great perplexity to my remorseful thoughts. That I was ashamed to tell him exactly how I was placed, and what I had come down to, I do not seek to conceal. But I hope my reluctance was not quite an unworthy one. He would want to help me out of his little savings, I knew, and I knew that he ought not to help me, and that I must not suffer him to do it. It was a thoughtful evening with both of us. But before we went to bed, I had resolved that I would wait over tomorrow being Sunday, and would begin my new course with the new week. On Monday morning, I would speak to Joe about this change. I would lay aside this last vestige of reserve. I would tell him what I had in my thoughts, that, secondly, not yet arrived at, and why I had not decided to go out to Herbert, and then the change would be conquered forever. As I cleared, Joe cleared, and it seemed as though he had sympathetically arrived at a resolution too. We had a quiet day on the Sunday, and we rode out into the country, and then walked in the fields. "I feel thankful that I have been ill, Joe," I said. "Dear old Pip, old chap, you're almost come round, sir." "It has been a memorable time for me, Joe." "Likewise for myself, sir," Joe returned. "We have had a time together, Joe, that I can never forget. There were days once, I know, that I did for a while forget, but I never shall forget these." "Pip," said Joe, appearing a little hurried and troubled, "there has been larks. And, dear sir, what have been betwixt us, have been." At night, when I had gone to bed, Joe came into my room, as he had done all through my recovery. He asked me if I felt sure that I was as well as in the morning. "Yes, dear Joe, quite." "And are always a-getting stronger, old chap?" "Yes, dear Joe, steadily." Joe patted the coverlet on my shoulder with his great good hand and said, in what I thought a husky voice, "Good night." When I got up in the morning, refreshed and stronger yet, I was full of my resolution to tell Joe all without delay. I would tell him before breakfast. I would dress at once and go to his room and surprise him, for it was the first day I had been up early. I went to his room, and he was not there. Not only was he not there, but his box was gone. I hurried then to the breakfast table, and on it found a letter. These were its brief contents. "Not wishful to intrude, I have departed, for you are well again, dear Pip, and will do better without J.O. P.S. Ever the best of friends." Enclosed in the letter was a receipt for the debt and costs on which I had been arrested. Down to that moment, I'd vainly supposed that my creditor had withdrawn or suspended proceedings until I should be quite recovered. I'd never dreamed of Joe's having paid the money, but Joe had paid it, and the receipt was in his name. What remained for me now but to follow him to the dear old forge, and there to have out my disclosure to him, and my penitent remonstrance with him, and there to relieve my mind and heart of that reserved. Secondly, which had begun as a vague something lingering in my thoughts, and had formed into a settled purpose. The purpose was that I would go to Biddy, that I would show her how humbled and repentant I came back, that I would tell her how I had lost all I once hoped for, that I would remind her of our old confidences in my first unhappy time. Then I would say to her, "Biddy, I think you once liked me very well, when my errant heart, even while it strayed away from you, was quieter and better with you than it ever has been since. If you can like me only half as well once more, if you can take me with all my faults and disappointments on my head, if you can receive me like a forgiven child, and indeed, I am as sorry, Biddy, and have as much need of a hushing voice and a soothing hand. I hope I am a little worthier of you than I was, not much, but a little. And Biddy, it shall rest with you to say whether I shall work at the forge with Joe, or whether I shall try for any different occupation down in this country, or whether we shall go away to a distant place where an opportunity awaits me, which I set aside, when it was offered, until I knew your answer. And now, dear Biddy, if you can tell me that you will go through the world with me, you will surely make it a better world for me, and me a better man for it, and I will try hard to make it a better world for you." Such was my purpose. After 3 days more of recovery, I went down to the old place to put it in execution. And how I sped in it is all I have left to tell. Chapter 58. The tidings of my high fortunes having had a heavy fall had got down to my native place and its neighborhood before I got there. I found the Blue Boar in possession of the intelligence, and I found that it made a great change in the Boar's demeanor. Whereas the Boar had cultivated my good opinion with warm assiduity when I was coming into property, the Boar was exceedingly cool on the subject now that I was going out of property. It was evening when I arrived, much fatigued by the journey I had so often made so easily. The Boar could not put me into my usual bedroom, which was engaged, probably by someone who had expectations, and could only assign me a very indifferent chamber among the pigeons and post-chaises up the yard. But I had as sound a sleep in that lodging as in the most superior accommodation the Boar could have given me, and the quality of my dreams was about the same as in the best bedroom. Early in the morning, while my breakfast was getting ready, I strolled round by Sada's house. There were printed bills on the gate and on bits of carpet hanging out of the windows, announcing a sale by auction of the household furniture and effects next week. The house itself was to be sold as old building materials and pulled down. Lot 1 was marked in whitewashed knock-knee letters on the brew house, Lot 2 on that part of the main building which had been so long shut up. Other lots were marked off on other parts of the structure, and the ivy had been torn down to make room for the inscriptions, and much of it trailed low in the dust and was withered already. Stepping in for a moment at the open gate, and looking around me with the uncomfortable air of a stranger who had no business there, I saw the auctioneer's clerk walking on the casks and telling them off for the information of a catalog compiler, pen in hand, who made a temporary desk of the wheeled chair I had so often pushed along to the tune of Old Clem. When I got back to my breakfast in the Boar's coffee room, I found Mr. Pumblechook conversing with the landlord. Mr. Pumblechook, not improved in appearance by his late nocturnal adventure, was waiting for me, and addressed me in the following terms. "Young man, I am sorry to see you brought low, but what else could be expected? What else could be expected?" As he extended his hand with a magnificently forgiving air, and as I was broken by illness and unfit to quarrel, I took it. "William," said Mr. Pumblechook to the waiter, "put a muffin on table, and has it come to this? Has it come to this?" I frowningly sat down to my breakfast. Mr. Pumblechook stood over me and poured out my tea, before I could touch the teapot, with the air of a benefactor who was resolved to be true to the last. "William," said Mr. Pumblechook mournfully. "Put the salt on, in happier times," addressing me. "I think you took sugar. And did you take milk?" "You did. Sugar and milk. William, bring a watercress." "Thank you," said I shortly, "but I don't eat watercresses." "You don't eat 'em," returned Mr. Pumblechook, sighing and nodding his head several times, as if he might have expected that, and as if abstinence from watercresses were consistent with my downfall. "True, the simple fruits of the earth. No, you needn't bring any, William." I went on with my breakfast, and Mr. Pumblechook continued to stand over me, staring fishily and breathing noisily, as he always did. "Little more than skin and bone," mused Mr. Pumblechook, aloud. "And yet when he went from here, I may say with my blessing, and I spread afore him my humble store, like the bee, he was as plump as a peach." This reminded me of the wonderful difference between the servile manner in which he had offered his hand in my new prosperity, saying, "May I?" and the ostentatious clemency with which he had just now exhibited the same fat 5 fingers. "Ha!" he went on, handing me the bread and butter. "And ere you going to Joseph?" "In heaven's name," said I, firing in spite of myself, "what does it matter to you where I'm going? Leave that teapot alone." It was the worst course I could have taken, because it gave Pumblechook the opportunity he wanted. "Yes, young man," said he, releasing the handle of the article in question, retiring a step or two from my table, and speaking for the behoof of the landlord and waiter at the door. "I will leave that teapot alone. You are right, young man. For once, you are right. I forget myself when I take such an interest in your breakfast as to wish your frame, exhausted by the debilitating effects of prodigality, to be stimulated by the wholesome nourishment of your forefathers." "And yet," said Pumblechook, turning to the landlord and waiter, and pointing me out at arm's length, "this is him as I ever sported with in his days of happy infancy. Tell me not it cannot be. I tell you this is him." A low murmur from the two replied. The waiter appeared to be particularly affected. "This is him," said Pumblechook, "as I have rode in my shay-cart. This is him as I have seen brought up by hand. This is him unto the sister of which I was uncle by marriage, as her name was Georgiana Maria from her own mother. Let him deny it if he can." The waiter seemed convinced that I could not deny it, and that it gave the case a black look. "Young man," said Pumblechook, screwing his head at me in the old fashion, "you air a-going to Joseph. What does it matter to me, you ask me, where you air a-going? I say to you, sir, you air a-going to Joseph." The waiter coughed, as if he modestly invited me to get over that. "Now," said Pumblechook, and all this with a most exasperating air of saying in the cause of virtue what was perfectly convincing and conclusive, "I will tell you what to say to Joseph. Here is Squires of the Boar present, known and respected in this town, and here is William, which his father's name was Potkins, if I do not deceive myself." "You do not, sir," said William. "In their presence," pursued Pumblechook, "I will tell you, young man, what to say to Joseph. Says you, 'Joseph, I have this day seen my earliest benefactor and the founder of my fortunes.' I will name no names, Joseph, but so they are pleased to call him uptown, and I have seen that man." "I swear I don't see him here," said I. "Say that likewise," retorted Pumblechook. "Say you said that, and even Joseph will probably betray surprise." "There you quite mistake him," said I. "I know better." "Says you," Pumblechook went on, "Joseph, I have seen that man, and that man bears you no malice and bears me no malice. He knows your character, Joseph, and is well acquainted with your pig-headedness and ignorance, and he knows my character, Joseph, and he knows my want of gratitude." "Yes, Joseph," says you. Here Pumblechook shook his head and hand at me. "He knows my total deficiency of common human gratitude. He knows it, Joseph, as none can. You do not know it, Joseph, having no call to know it, but that man do." Windy donkey as he was, it really amazed me that he could have the face to talk thus to mine. Says you, "Joseph, he gave me a little message which I will now repeat. It was that, in my being brought low, he saw the finger of Providence. He knowed that finger when he saw Joseph, and he saw it plain. It pinted out this writing, Joseph, reward of ingratitude to his earliest benefactor and founder of Fortins. But that man said he did not repent of what he had done, Joseph. Not at all. It was right to do it, it was kind to do it, it was benevolent to do it, and he would do it again. It's pity, said I, scornfully, as I finished my interrupted breakfast, that the man did not say what he had done and would do again. Squires of the Boar. Pumblechook was now addressing the landlord. And William. I have no objections to your mentioning, either uptown or downtown, if such should be your wishes, that it was right to do it, kind to do it, benevolent to do it, and that I would do it again. With those words, the impostor shook them both by the hand, with an air, and left the house, leaving me much more astonished than delighted by the virtues of that same indefinite it. I was not long after him in leaving the house, too, and when I went down the high street, I saw him holding forth, no doubt to the same effect, at his shop door to a select group, who honored me with very unfavorable glances as I passed on the opposite side of the way. But it was only the pleasanter to turn to Biddy and to Joe, whose great forbearance shone more brightly than before, if that could be, contrasted with this brazen pretender. I went towards them slowly, for my limbs were weak, but with a sense of increasing relief as I drew nearer to them, and a sense of leaving arrogance and untruthfulness further and further behind. The June weather was delicious. The sky was blue, the larks were soaring high over the green corn. I thought all that countryside more beautiful and peaceful by far than I had ever known it to be yet. Many pleasant pictures of the life that I would lead there, and of the change for the better that would come over my character when I had a guiding spirit at my side whose simple faith and clear home wisdom I had proved, beguiled my way. They awakened a tender emotion in me, for my heart was softened by my return, and such a change had come to pass that I felt like one who was toiling home barefoot from distant travel, and whose wanderings had lasted many years. The schoolhouse where Biddy was mistress I had never seen, but the little roundabout lane by which I entered the village, for quietness' sake, took me past it. I was disappointed to find that the day was a holiday. No children were there, and Biddy's house was closed. Some hopeful notion of seeing her, busily engaged in her daily duties before she saw me, had been in my mind and was defeated. But the forge was a very short distance off, and I went towards it under the sweet green limes, listening for the clink of Joe's hammer. Long after I ought to have heard it, and long after I had fancied I heard it and found it, but a fancy, all was still. The limes were there, and the white thorns were there, and the chestnut trees were there, and their leaves rustled harmoniously when I stopped to listen. But the clink of Joe's hammer was not in the midsummer wind. Almost fearing, without knowing why, to come in view of the forge, I saw it at last and saw that it was closed. No gleam of fire, no glittering shower of sparks, no roar of bellows, all shut up and still. But the house was not deserted, and the best parlor seemed to be in use, for there were white curtains fluttering in its window, and the window was open and gay with flowers. I went softly towards it, meaning to peep over the flowers, when Joe and Biddy stood before me arm in arm. At first, Biddy gave a cry, as if she thought it was my apparition, but in another moment she was in my embrace. I wept to see her, and she wept to see me. I, because she looked so fresh and pleasant. She, because I looked so worn and white. But dear Biddy, how smart you are. Yes, dear Pip. And Joe, how smart you are. Yes, dear old Pip, old chap. I looked at both of them from one to the other, and then, "It's my wedding day," cried Biddy in a burst of happiness, "and I am married to Joe." They had taken me into the kitchen, and I had laid my head down on the old deal table. Biddy held one of my hands to her lips, and Joe's restoring touch was on my shoulder. "Which he weren't strong enough, my dear, fur to be surprised," said Joe, and Biddy said, "I ought to have thought of it, dear Joe, but I was too happy." They were both so overjoyed to see me, so proud to see me, so touched by my coming to them, so delighted that I should have come by accident to make their day complete. My first thought was one of great thankfulness that I had never breathed this last baffled hope to Joe. How often, while he was with me in my illness, had it risen to my lips? How irrevocable would have been his knowledge of it if he had remained with me but another hour. "Dear Biddy," said I, "you have the best husband in the whole world, and if you could have seen him by my bed you would have. But no, you couldn't love him better than you do." "No, I couldn't indeed," said Biddy. "And dear Joe, you have the best wife in the whole world, and she will make you as happy as even you deserve to be, you dear, good, noble Joe." Joe looked at me with a quivering lip and fairly put his sleeve before his eyes. "And Joe and Biddy both, as you have been to church today, and are in charity and love with all mankind, receive my humble thanks for all you have done for me, and all I have so ill repaid. And when I say that I am going away within the hour, for I am soon going abroad, and that I shall never rest until I have worked for the money with which you have kept me out of prison, and have sent it to you, don't think, dear Joe and Biddy, that if I could repay it 1,000 times over, I suppose I could cancel a farthing of the debt I owe you, or that I would do so if I could." They were both melted by these words, and both entreated me to say no more. But I must say more. "Dear Joe, I hope you will have children to love, and that some little fellow will sit in this chimney corner of a winter night who may remind you of another little fellow gone out of it forever. Don't tell him, Joe, that I was thankless. Don't tell him, Biddy, that I was ungenerous and unjust. Only tell him that I honored you both, because you were both so good and true, and that as your child, I said it would be natural to him to grow up a much better man than I did." "I ain't a-goin'," said Joe from behind his sleeve, "to tell him nothing of that nature, Pip. Nor Biddy ain't, nor yet no one ain't. And now, though I know you have already done it in your own kind hearts, pray tell me both that you forgive me. Pray let me hear you say the words, that I may carry the sound of them away with me, and then I shall be able to believe that you can trust me and think better of me in the time to come." "Oh, dear old Pip, old chap," said Joe, "God knows as I forgive you if I have anything to forgive." "Amen, and God knows I do," echoed Biddy. "Now let me go up and look at my old little room, and rest there a few minutes by myself, and then, when I have eaten and drunk with you, go with me as far as the finger-post, dear Joe and Biddy, before we say goodbye." I sold all I had, and put aside as much as I could for a composition with my creditors, who gave me ample time to pay them in full, and I went out and joined Herbert. Within a month, I had quitted England, and within 2 months I was clerk to Clarriker and Company, and within 4 months I assumed my first undivided responsibility. For the beam across the parlor ceiling at Mill Pond Bank had then ceased to tremble under old Bill Barley's growls, and was at peace, and Herbert had gone away to marry Clara, and I was left in sole charge of the eastern branch until he brought her back. Many a year went round before I was a partner in the house, but I lived happily with Herbert and his wife, and lived frugally, and paid my debts, and maintained a constant correspondence with Biddy and Joe. It was not until I became third in the firm that Clarriker betrayed me to Herbert, but he then declared that the secret of Herbert's partnership had been long enough upon his conscience, and he must tell it. So he told it, and Herbert was as much moved as amazed, and the dear fellow and I were not the worse friends for the long concealment. I must not leave it to be supposed that we were ever a great house, or that we made mints of money. We were not in a grand way of business, but we had a good name and worked for our profits, and did very well. We owed so much to Herbert's ever-cheerful industry and readiness that I often wondered how I had conceived that old idea of his inaptitude, until I was one day enlightened by the reflection that perhaps the inaptitude had never been in him at all, but had been in me. Chapter 59. For 11 years I had not seen Joe nor Biddy with my bodily eyes, though they had both been often before my fancy in the East, when upon an evening in December, an hour or two after dark, I laid my hand softly on the latch of the old kitchen door. I touched it so softly that I was not heard, and looked in unseen. There, smoking his pipe in the old place by the kitchen firelight, as hale and as strong as ever, though a little gray, sat Joe. And there, fenced into the corner with Joe's leg and sitting on my own little stool looking at the fire, was I again. We give him the name of Pip for your sake, dear old chap, said Joe, delighted, when I took another stool by the child's side, but I did not rumple his hair. "And we hoped he might grow a little bit like you, and we think he do." I thought so too, and I took him out for a walk next morning, and we talked immensely, understanding one another to perfection. And I took him down to the churchyard and set him on a certain tombstone there, and he showed me from that elevation which stone was sacred to the memory of Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above. "Biddy," said I, when I talked with her after dinner, as her little girl lay sleeping in her lap, "you must give Pip to me one of these days, or lend him at all events." "No, no," said Biddy gently. "You must marry." "So Herbert and Clara say, but I don't think I shall, Biddy. I've so settled down in their home that it's not at all likely. I'm already quite an old bachelor." Biddy looked down at her child and put its little hand to her lips, and then put the good matronly hand with which she had touched it into mine. There was something in the action and in the light pressure of Biddy's wedding ring that had a very pretty eloquence in it. "Dear Pip," said Biddy, "you're sure you don't fret for her?" "Oh no, I think not, Biddy. Tell me as an old friend, have you quite forgotten her?" "My dear Biddy, I have forgotten nothing in my life that ever had a foremost place there, and little that ever had any place there. But that poor dream, as I once used to call it, has all gone by, Biddy, all gone by." Nevertheless, I knew while I said those words that I secretly intended to revisit the site of the old house that evening, alone for her sake. Yes, even so, for Estella's sake. I had heard of her as leading a most unhappy life, and as being separated from her husband, who had used her with great cruelty, and who had become quite renowned as a compound of pride, avarice, brutality, and meanness. And I had heard of the death of her husband, from an accident consequent on his ill treatment of a horse. This release had befallen her some 2 years before. For anything I knew, she was married again. The early dinner hour at Joe's left me abundance of time, without hurrying my talk with Biddy, to walk over to the old spot before dark. But, what with loitering on the way to look at old objects and to think of old times, the day had quite declined when I came to the place. There was no house now, no brewery, no building whatever left but the wall of the old garden. The cleared space had been enclosed with a rough fence, and looking over it, I saw that some of the old ivy had struck root anew, and was growing green on low, quiet mounds of ruin. A gate in the fence standing ajar, I pushed it open and went in. A cold, silvery mist had veiled the afternoon, and the moon was not yet up to scatter it. But the stars were shining beyond the mist, and the moon was coming, and the evening was not dark. I could trace out where every part of the old house had been, and where the brewery had been, and where the gates, and where the casks. I had done so, and was looking along the desolate garden walk, when I beheld a solitary figure in it. The figure showed itself aware of me as I advanced. It had been moving towards me, but it stood still. As I drew nearer, I saw it to be the figure of a woman. As I drew nearer yet, it was about to turn away when it stopped and let me come up with it. Then it faltered, as if much surprised, and uttered my name, and I cried out, "Estella, I'm greatly changed. I wonder you know me." The freshness of her beauty was indeed gone, but its indescribable majesty and its indescribable charm remained. Those attractions in it I had seen before. What I had never seen before was the saddened, softened light of the once proud eyes. What I had never felt before was the friendly touch of the once insensible hand. We sat down on a bench that was near, and I said, "After so many years, it is strange that we should thus meet again, Estella, here where our first meeting was. Do you often come back?" "I have never been here since." "Nor I." The moon began to rise, and I thought of the placid look at the white ceiling, which had passed away. The moon began to rise, and I thought of the pressure on my hand when I had spoken the last words he had heard on earth. Estella was the next to break the silence that ensued between us. "I have very often hoped and intended to come back, but have been prevented by many circumstances. Poor old place." The silvery mist was touched with the first rays of the moonlight, and the same rays touched the tears that dropped from her eyes. Not knowing that I saw them, and setting herself to get the better of them, she said quietly, "Were you wondering, as you walked along, how it came to be left in this condition?" "Yes, Estella. The ground belongs to me. It is the only possession I have not relinquished. Everything else has gone from me, little by little, but I have kept this. It was the subject of the only determined resistance I made in all the wretched years." "Is it to be built on?" "At last it is. I came here to take leave of it before its change. And you," she said, in a voice of touching interest to a wanderer, "you live abroad still?" "Still. And do well, I'm sure. I work pretty hard for a sufficient living, and therefore, yes, I do well." "I have often thought of you," said Estella. "Have you?" "Of late, very often. There was a long, hard time when I kept far from me the remembrance of what I had thrown away when I was quite ignorant of its worth. But since my duty has not been incompatible with the admission of that remembrance, I have given it a place in my heart." "You have always held your place in my heart," I answered, and we were silent again until she spoke. "I little thought," said Estella, "that I should take leave of you in taking leave of this spot. I am very glad to do so." "Glad to part again, Estella. To me, parting is a painful thing. To me, the remembrance of our last parting has been ever mournful and painful." "But you said to me," returned Estella very earnestly, "God bless you, God forgive you. And if you could say that to me then, you will not hesitate to say that to me now, when suffering has been stronger than all other teaching, and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be. I have been bent and broken, but, I hope, into a better shape. Be as considerate and good to me as you were, and tell me we are friends." "We are friends," said I, rising and bending over her as she rose from the bench. "And will continue friends apart," said Estella. I took her hand in mine, and we went out of the ruined place. And as the morning mists had risen long ago when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now, and in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed to me, I saw no shadow of another parting from her.